Hi, Guy. You're lying in bed. The fan's hum has become your lullaby, and somewhere between sleep and wakefulness, your mind floats, wandering. And that's when you feel it. Not a chill, not fear, but a scent. Something ancient. Not the scent of lavender soap or fresh linens. No, this is deeper, darker, riper. Something that clings. Something that reeks of forgotten rituals and long-dead gods. If you let yourself breathe it in, you'll find yourself not in your room, but back in a palace of gilded delusion, where beauty was born in filth and queens bathed in crocodile dung to become immortal. Welcome, sleepless soul. Welcome to Egypt. Welcome to the skin of Cleopatra. Not the skin you imagine, perfumed and kissed by moonlight, but the skin she scrubbed raw with ground seashells and rubbed down with oils mixed with crushed beetles and, well, worse. Much worse. We don't tell the truth about queens, not at night. At night, we prefer the legend. The Cleopatra who seduced Caesar and broke Rome's spine with a glance. The Cleopatra whose voice was silk, whose lips were spells. But what if I told you that every whisper of that silk was soaked in sweat from a day inside a linen wrap stained with desert salt and human oil? That her beauty, meticulously curated, was not made in scented baths of milk and roses, but in steaming pits of animal fat, fermented fish, and yes, even the fetid droppings of Egypt's most sacred predator? It is too easy to romanticize filth when time has yellowed its edges. But history is not a painting. It's a compost heap. And Cleopatra, for all her elegance, lived in a world where cleanliness was not sterile, but spiritual. Not scientific, but symbolic. They didn't scrub to kill germs. They scrubbed to summon gods. Let me ask you something. Have you ever been so desperate to preserve your youth, your power, your very soul, that you would smear yourself in rot and call it beauty? Have you ever been told that the only way to stay desirable is to decay on purpose? Cleopatra was. And so she obeyed. Every morning began with the same ritual. Not a prayer, not a song, but the gathering of excrement. Crocodile dung. Still warm, still wet. Pulled from the sacred marshes where the Nile hissed and stank like a god in heat. Her servants, masked with linen soaked in frankincense to shield their noses, would carry the fetid green-brown mass in ornate jars. They didn't question. They didn't flinch. This was the price of divinity. You see, to be a queen in Egypt wasn't merely to rule. It was to become a goddess. And goddesses do not stink. They transcend stink. They alchemize it. They turn waste into wonder. That was the belief. That was the curse. And so, the dung became her potion. It was mixed with donkey milk and powdered pearls. It was warmed under the sun until it bubbled slightly, that perfect moment before fermentation turned to rot. Then it was rubbed onto her thighs, her belly, her breasts. Slowly, methodically. The dung, rich in ammonia, bleached the skin. The milk softened it. The pearls shimmered in the sun, as if Osiris himself had breathed on her. And it worked, in a way. Men said she glowed. Poets wrote that her skin was moonlight made flesh, but they never wrote about the smell. They never dared. Because Cleopatra's power was not just in what she showed, but in what she hid. She was, after all, a woman in a world where cleanliness was privilege, not default. A world where perfume masked disease, and makeup was painted over sores. A world where slaves bathed their masters with spit and oil, and public baths boiled in bacteria. Cleopatra's court was no exception. Her palace may have shimmered with gold, but beneath every corridor was a trail of sour sweat, incense smoke, and human waste baked into limestone. But she knew this. She wielded it. While the Romans scoffed at Egyptian rites, she turned every grotesque ritual into an aura of mysticism. Her filth was not ordinary. It was curated, controlled, alchemized into allure. That is perhaps the most terrifying thing about her. Not that she smeared herself with crocodile dung, but that she made you believe it was perfume. And don't mistake this as insanity. It was genius, tactical, psychological warfare wrapped in linen and soaked in lotus oil. When Caesar met her, he didn't see a woman covered in animal secretions. He saw Isis incarnate. And by the time he smelled the rot under her perfume, it was too late. He already loved her. You might be gagging now. You might be imagining the texture, the slick warmth of dung as it was spread on her thighs. You might feel the bile in your throat. That's good. That means you're finally understanding what power costs. Because Cleopatra didn't get to just be beautiful. She had to weaponize every part of her, even her hygiene. Especially her hygiene. Every bath, every scrub, every application of dung or oil or crushed insect, it wasn't for pleasure. It was survival. It was theater. It was seduction through endurance. Her body was a stage where politics, perfume, and putrefaction danced in delicate balance. And what's more, she wasn't alone. Her ladies-in-waiting followed suit. Her court was a mosaic of ritual rot. They used bat dung to tighten their skin, fish guts to perfume their hair, wasp venom to puff their lips. But none of them were as bold as her. Cleopatra bathed in extremes. She didn't shy from disgust. She drank it, breathed it, became it. And the people loved her for it, or feared her, which, in those days, was better. You're still awake, aren't you? Good. Because you need to be. This story is not for the sleeping. It's for the wide-eyed, the insomniacs, the ones who want to see behind the veil, and then wish they hadn't. Because what we're about to unravel, piece by festering piece, is not just Cleopatra's hygiene. It's her world, her war, her wisdom. It's the slow, sticky truth that beauty has always been a lie told through pain. And maybe, just maybe, you'll look at yourself differently tomorrow morning when you step into your hot, sterile shower, armed with soap and science. Maybe you'll remember the queen who bathed in rot so you could bathe in peace. Or maybe you'll smell something ancient, something wet, something sacred. And you'll wonder, just for a second, what price would you pay for immortality? You still smell it, don't you? That lingering note of wet heat and broken things. You think it's your imagination. You want it to be your imagination. But Cleopatra's scent was not meant to be forgotten. It was meant to haunt. Because it wasn't a scent. It was a spell. Not the kind sung by witches or whispered by priests, but one that soaked through your skin, crawled inside your lungs, and made your memory betray you for years to come. And if you dared to follow her, if you dared to walk barefoot through the tiled halls of her palace, where even the marble sweated, you'd find that her magic was not hidden in libraries or temples, but in the most repulsive corners of the human body. And it began at dawn. Not the soft, pastel kind of dawn you've seen in paintings, but a bruised, yellow dawn that smeared across the Nile like old butter. This was the hour of collection. Servants moved quickly, their feet wrapped in cloth to muffle the sound, their nostrils flaring beneath perfumed veils. Outside the city, just past the edge of stone and shade, crocodiles lay in their own filth, blinking with indifference as their dung was scraped into jars of alabaster and clay. It was not a task for the squeamish. The dung was still steaming. Flies circled in ecstatic halos. And yet the jars were handled like relics. Because they were. Cleopatra believed, no, Cleopatra knew, that nature's vilest offerings contained the purest power. Not because the priests told her so, but because centuries of queens had proven it with their skin, their blood, their breath. This was not about superstition. This was about control. The kind of control only the truly disgusting can grant. When the jars arrived in the palace, the process began without ceremony. There was no orchestra, no chorus, no fawning. Just the clinking of glass, the rustle of linen, the low murmurs of attendants who had long stopped gagging. Cleopatra stood naked in the center of her chamber, not like a woman awaiting pleasure, but like a soldier awaiting armor. Her body was not an object. It was an altar, and this altar had to be anointed with waste, not because she enjoyed it, not because she was deranged, but because she had to. You must understand, power in her world did not come from laws or armies or even gold. It came from illusion, from myth. And myths are not maintained with silk. They are forged in fire and wrought, and things most people won't touch with bare hands. Cleopatra's first layer was always the paste, a vile mixture of crocodile dung, fermented barley, and the milk of desert donkeys. It looked like sewage and smelled like fermentation at war with feces, but it had texture. It clung. It coated, and as it was applied, slowly, by the gloved hands of her most loyal attendants, it began to heat, reacting to the warmth of her skin. The scent filled the room like a prophecy, sweet, sour, sharp, ancient. And beneath it, Cleopatra closed her eyes and breathed deeply, not because she liked it, but because this was the scent of sacrifice. Her own. You must remember, this was not a time of dermatology. There was no chemical peel, no retinol, no refrigerated jade roller. There was this. A queen, covered in dung, baking under the sun that watched empires rise and fall. And you ask yourself, why? Why would the most powerful woman in the ancient world smear herself with such degradation? The answer is in the mirror. Yours, because you do it too. You call it exfoliation. You call it detox. You call it sacrifice for beauty. But your scrubs are just branded sand, and your creams are just diluted chemicals with names you can't pronounce. Cleopatra's routine was more honest, more primal. She did not hide her rot behind cucumber peels and smiling spa attendants. She embraced it. She amplified it. She let the world know that her beauty came not from hiding her filth, but from mastering it. And it was this mastery that terrified the Romans. They didn't understand her. They called her sorceress, whore, devil. But they were not offended by her body. They were offended by her power. Because what Roman woman would dare to wear crocodile dung like a crown? What Roman man could face a queen who weaponized her own waste? To them, hygiene was a practice. To Cleopatra, it was politics. Every pore on her body was a campaign. Every bath was a negotiation. Every scent was a declaration of war. And her chambers were a battlefield. You could smell the war before you saw it. The mixture of myrrh and mold, of honey and heat, of jasmine crushed into fat and sweat fermented into incense. The floors were scrubbed with salt and ash. The walls were coated in crushed rose mixed with vinegar to mask the omnipresent odor of humanity. And through it all, Cleopatra moved like smoke, deliberate, unreadable, intoxicating. But don't mistake her calm for comfort. She suffered. The dung burned her skin some days. The beetle-based cosmetics made her eyes itch and swell. The perfume gave her migraines, but she endured. Not because she was a martyr, but because the alternative was worse. To be clean, truly clean, in her world was to be weak. Invisible, replaceable. The desert did not reward sterility. It rewarded strength. And strength, in her case, came from the stomach to bathe in death and emerge divine. Her enemies bathed in marble. She bathed in fear, and that made all the difference. It's easy to forget that Cleopatra wasn't just trying to survive. She was trying to outlive, to outshine, to outseduce every man, every empire, every whisper that dared question her throne. And she knew, deep in her bones, that no crown stays on a woman's head unless her body is more myth than meat. So she created her own myth, one layer at a time. After the dung came the oils, thick, dark, pungent, made from crushed olives, rancid fat, and herbs that only grew on grave sites. The oil sealed the rot in, made it shimmer. Her skin glistened not with dew, but with decomposition glossed into gold. And still she stood, stoic, breathing, becoming. Then came the makeup, kohl made from burnt bones, lip paint made from crushed bugs, cheek tint made from rust. Her face became a mask, a weapon, a symbol. And when she was done, she did not look human. She looked like a warning. This was her armor. And every morning, she donned it with the same care Caesar put into his cuirass. Because she knew, one crack in the illusion, and it would all fall. One scent too honest, one flake of dung in the wrong place, one servant who whispered, and she would become mortal. And mortals die, so she doubled down. She made her filth sacred, her rituals untouchable. She claimed that the gods had given her the recipe, that dung was divine, that crocodiles were her kin. And people believed, because belief, like rot, spreads fastest when the air is thick and no one's allowed to open a window. And there were no windows in Cleopatra's palace, only small slits that let the stench out just enough to keep the rumors in. You may think this is exaggeration, that no queen would ever do this, but history does not care what you think is likely. It only records what was done. And Cleopatra did what needed to be done. She understood that in a world where women were bartered and broken for power, she had to become something untradeable, something unforgettable, something so layered in ritual and rot that no one could ever copy her without vomiting. And that, dear sleepless one, is genius. Because while others washed away their stink to please men, Cleopatra became the stink and made men beg for it. You still smell it, don't you? If you close your eyes now, you might imagine her scent as something manageable, some mixture of myrrh and musk, maybe something earthy, a touch of temple incense clinging politely to silk. But if you really dared to inhale the truth, if you let your lungs forget what they've been taught to desire, you would not find perfume. You would find fear, ambition, and fermentation curling together like serpents in heat. You would find a stench so precise it had intention. Cleopatra didn't wear perfume to smell sweet. She wore it to an aid. It was her most silent ambassador. Before her feet even entered a room, her scent arrived. A fugitive fusion of almond oil rotting in clay, pot sandalwood boiled in goat marrow, and that ghost of crocodile waste that no amount of rose water could silence. It announced her long before her name did, and long after she left, it clung like prophecy to the walls, to the men, to the memory. It was not meant to please. It was meant to possess, and possession was always the point. Because the truth no one wants to whisper is that Cleopatra didn't seduce Rome. She consumed it, not with lips or hips, but with the strategy of someone who knew that the most dangerous currency was not gold or grain, but presence, ubiquity, that unshakable echo of she was here in every breath, every fiber, every drop of sweat. And so she turned her body into legend, her rituals into lore, her filth into legacy. Even Caesar, that lion of the Republic, found himself silenced by the smell. When he first met her, not on a throne, not in a parade, but unwrapped from a rug like a relic exhumed, the air shifted. Not because of beauty, not because of charm, but because the room, until that moment, had smelled like marble and dust. And now it smelled like something alive, not fresh, not floral, but alive. And Caesar, for all his armor and gods, had never smelled that before. You see, Cleopatra understood something we've forgotten. That to truly conquer someone, you don't touch them. You surround them. You enter their breath. You haunt their senses. She knew that cleanliness is forgettable, but rot lingers. Rot clings. Rot becomes part of you. And so she chose rot, deliberately, precisely. As others chose marble columns and golden cuffs, she chose beetle stains, fish oil mascara, and menstrual blood perfume laced with crushed lavender, and lion sweat. Yes, lion sweat. Her alchemists extracted it in secret, boiling the skins of captured beasts under moonlight, distilling dominance into drops. It wasn't just for effect. It was for memory. Because no soldier forgets the moment they smelled a woman who carried the scent of predator. Her nights were no reprieve. After the rituals of rot had hardened, and her mask of divinity had dried on her flesh like a second skin, she did not wash it away. No, she slept in it. Beneath veils embroidered with golden scarabs, and beside incense, burners exhaling blue smoke, Cleopatra let the dung dry on her thighs. The oil crust along her collarbone, the beetle-red pigment smear her lips into something that looked like a wound, too sacred to heal. Servants slept on the floor in silence, listening to her breath grow shallow, never knowing if she was dreaming of conquest or survival, because to her, they were the same. And somewhere in the darkness, a mouse would scurry past, chased by the scent, repelled by the heat. Even vermin understood. She was not food. She was famine dressed in flesh. By morning, the mask would crack. Thin flakes of dung and fat and dried milk would peel from her skin like the bark of some ancient tree shedding last season as lies. And the first bath did not cleanse her. It melted her. Warm water mixed with vinegar and salt would soften the crust, and she would sit in silence as the filth of yesterday slithered off her body in slow gray ribbons. Only then did she whisper, not prayers, instructions, because while her body was being restored, her empire moved, letters dispatched, spies repositioned, lovers reassessed. Every flake of rot that floated to the bath's surface was a layer of strategy shed, not abandoned, but transformed. The dung that touched her yesterday would soon touch her enemies. In letters sealed with wax, in scrolls scented with the oils once smeared across her breasts, even war smelled like her. And if this seems excessive to you, good. Because you have never ruled a kingdom from beneath 1,000 eyes, all waiting for your skin to sag or your breath to sour. Cleopatra's world did not reward aging. It punished hesitation. One crack in the illusion, and you were not queen, you were carcass. And so, she stayed ahead. Not with armies, but with arsenals of bodily sacrifice. She invented her own pharmacy, hidden in the basements of the palace. Not a sterile place, but a laboratory of ancient agony. Jars of dried snakes, urns of fermented placenta, amphorae filled with stale breast milk collected from concubines too poor to protest. Her alchemists wore veils, not for ritual, but for survival. The fumes from her mixtures caused blindness, nosebleeds, hallucinations. But Cleopatra insisted. The line between pain and perfume was where power bloomed. She bathed in it. Literally. Once a month, when the moon was darkest, she would immerse herself in what they called the womb. It was not a bath. It was a vat. A carved-out slab of obsidian filled with goat blood, fish bile, powdered quartz, and the feces of sacred birds. No man was allowed near it. Only her women, pale with fear, loyal by force, poured in the mixture while she stood still, arms wide, eyes open. She didn't flinch. Because this was not self-care. This was resurrection. Each soak was a shedding, a rebirth. The rot washed over her not to clean her, but to baptize her in her own myth. She emerged not fragrant, but unforgettable. And that was the point. She understood what modern queens forget. That to be clean is to be temporary. But to be marked, deeply, permanently, hideously, is to be remembered. Cleopatra didn't want to be loved. She wanted to be inescapable. And inescapable she was. Even now, millennia later, as you try to forget what you've read, try to silence. The part of your brain that is imagining the texture of bird shit and goat blood sliding across a breast, once kissed by emperors. Even now you remember her. You breathe her. You wear her. Because her rot lives in you now. It has curled into your imagination and built a nest. And it will not leave. Not tonight. Not ever. It was always the mirror that betrayed her first. Not the enemies, not the whispers in foreign tongues, not even the trembling of tired limbs at dusk, but the mirror. That slab of polished obsidian, leaning like a silent priest in the corner of her chamber, too smooth to lie, too dark to flatter. Cleopatra would stare into it as if it held Rome's secrets, but it only gave her her own reflection, stripped of incense, stripped of ritual, stripped of empire, just the shape of a woman who was slowly rotting, not from time, but from effort. And still she stared, every morning, every night, naked, always naked, not for vanity, but for war, because a body that would be remembered had to be inspected like a battlefield, and hers was. Lashes scorched from crushed charcoal, lips permanently stained with oxblood dye, skin blotched with patches from last week's bile bath that hadn't fully healed. Her thighs were raw. Her scalp often bled from the bronze combs dipped in fermented olive oil, meant to birth shine from agony. She smelled of stories, but not the kind with happy endings. And yet she didn't blink. She stood before that mirror like a general counting her dead, making peace with the cost, already planning the next siege. Because Cleopatra did not bathe in dung and blood to feel beautiful. She did it to feel real, to feel solid, to prove that she was still there, still more than a myth sewn together by poets who had never once tasted her skin or stood in the same room long enough to gag. The rot reminded her. It held her, anchored her to the pain of power. Because what is a queen, really, if not the one person who must never be allowed to forget she is dying just a little faster than everyone else? And in that mirror, sometimes, not often, but sometimes, she saw the girl. The one before the dung, before the vomit rituals, before the oils so toxic they burned holes in her favorite linens. The girl who used to laugh. The girl who had dreams that did not include draining the glands of frogs to mix with her bathwater, in case it might make her scent more mysterious. But the girl never stayed long. The rot chased her away, as it always did. There was no room for softness in Cleopatra's world. Only softness to weaponize. Even her laughter was rehearsed, not in sound, but in scent. Her alchemists learned to produce oils that mimicked emotions. Joy was a blend of burned fig and crushed mint. Grief smelled of rotting roses and iron. Anger was cedar ash. So when Cleopatra laughed, the air changed. And no one dared to question if the laughter was real. The air told them it was. That was the level of mastery she demanded. Even her emotions had to be olfactory. Even her grief had to be curated. Because how else do you survive as a woman? The world has declared either divine or disposable. How else do you anchor yourself to history without letting it swallow you whole? She knew what they called her behind jeweled doors. Not queen, not goddess, but witch, beast, rot queen. And she smiled, because witches don't beg, beasts don't weep, and rot, once it settles in, can never be removed. That's why tombs smell the way they do. That's why power always reeks of something just slightly wrong. And that was her greatest triumph. She made herself slightly wrong. Not wrong enough to revolt against. Not wrong enough to exile. Just wrong enough to make every man wonder if the unease in his belly was fear or desire. Just wrong enough to make generals sweat beneath their armor. Just wrong enough to make Caesar write to Rome in phrases that sounded more like confessions than strategy. Because Cleopatra didn't conquer with armies. She conquered with discomfort. A discomfort so visceral, so all-consuming, it became indistinguishable from obsession. There was a night, one of many, when the palace windows howled, not from wind, from something deeper. A storm that never reached the sky but coiled beneath the tiles, in the foundations. That night, she did not sleep. She wandered the halls barefoot, leaving behind prints of oil. and residue, trailing a scent of decay so thick it clung to the drapes. She paused outside the chamber of her youngest servant, the one who still cried during the dung application, the one who still whispered prayers to gods no longer worshipped. And Cleopatra, barefoot and shining in oils thick as blood, whispered through the door, "Does the rot scare you?" There was no answer, only a whimper. She smiled, not cruelly, not even proudly, just knowingly. It should, because it was not just her armor, it was her weapon, her invitation, her wall. She had become so much more than queen. She had become climate. You didn't just meet Cleopatra. You entered her. Every room she walked into, she changed its oxygen, its pressure, its soul. She was not a guest in space. She was the space. And when she left, nothing smelled right again. That's why men followed her to ruin. That's why priests rewrote scripture to include her name. That's why enemies who plotted her death secretly kept vials of her scent sealed in rings, in cabinets, in coffins. To remember, or maybe to never forget what they couldn't kill. Even death feared her. Because rot already lived inside her. She had tamed it. And what dies, really, when the soul has already been embalmed in ritual long before the body follows? There is a sound no one talks about, not the drumbeat of war, not the hiss of betrayal, not the clink of goblets lifted in feigned loyalty, but the sound of flesh drying beneath layers of sacred filth. The way the skin tightens as oils thicken into paste, the slight tearing of scabs not yet ready to be born again. It's the sound of sacrifice whispered in wrinkles. Cleopatra knew it better than she knew the voices of her own advisors. Because that sound was hers. The soft, brittle crackle of becoming something not quite human anymore, and doing it anyway. Every morning she made herself a tomb and a temple. Her body, scrubbed raw and dressed in rot, was no longer hers. It hadn't been for years. Not since she realized that the world did not want Cleopatra. It wanted what Cleopatra meant. And once a woman becomes meaning, she loses all her softness, all her sleep, all her scent, until she manufactures one that can replace it. There were moments, few and far between, when the mask almost fell, not in public, not with Caesar, not with Antony, but alone in the hours between moonlight and morning, when even the palace itself seemed to hold its breath. In those moments when her skin ached from the dung that had cracked, too deep when her eyes stung from eyeliner made of ash and sweat and disappointment. When her womb ached not from desire, but from disuse, she would lean her head back and wonder, when was the last time someone touched her without flinching? Because that's what no one understood. Her rituals did not make her untouchable by choice. They made her untouchable by consequence. Even those who worshipped her, and there were many, dared not brush against her skin for too long. Not out of respect, but out of fear. That the smell would cling, that the rot would spread, that their memory would be rewritten by a scent they couldn't escape. And yet, she continued. She perfected the filth, sharpened it, made her oils more pungent, her pastes more potent, not to push people away, but to pull them in so close that they could never look away again. Like staring into a fire that burns wrong, blue at the edges, too quiet to be safe. Even her lovers, those trembling, powerful men who thought they were taming Egypt, or simply moths dancing too, close to a torch soaked in crocodile piss and lion sweat. They loved her not because of her softness, but because of her willingness to sacrifice it. They smelled her before they tasted her, and by the time they kissed her, it was already too late. They were no longer men. They were devotees, and she never forgot it. Every moan, every gasp, every whispered goddess, it was never about love. It was about conquest. And she let them think they were the conquerors. Let them climb into her bed coated in foreign dreams, only to realize halfway through the ritual that they were not inside her. They were inside history. And it was swallowing them whole, because no one touches Cleopatra and walks away clean. And maybe that was the point all along, that she had stopped being a person long ago. Somewhere between the jars of fermented piss and the priestess's chants, somewhere between the soot-drenched eyeliner and the bleeding scalp, somewhere between sacrifice and survival, she stopped being herself. She became the idea of herself, polished, painted, pickled in oils so thick they could mummify her long before death dared to try. It's strange, isn't it, that we think of power as something you hold. But Cleopatra taught us that real power is something you become, and becoming it costs everything, even breath, even warmth, even the comfort of your own skin. Because her skin no longer welcomed her. It itched with ritual, burned with legacy. She couldn't lie down without the scent of rot rising back up to meet her. Couldn't move without hearing the soft slosh of half-dried oil between her thighs. Couldn't eat without tasting the perfume on her fingertips. Couldn't sleep without dreaming of the next concoction, the next sacrifice, the next layer of sacred disgust. And there was no going back. Not because she wouldn't, but because there was no back left to go to. Once a woman crosses that threshold, from flesh to myth, from sweat to symbol, she cannot undress. She cannot wash off the story. The narrative has soaked too deep. The filth has merged with the pores. The crocodile dung has become skin. And so she leaned in. She leaned in harder than anyone before her. She designed new rituals, not for need, but for theater. A daily ingestion of fermented fish bile to bless her breath. A monthly bleed offered not to gods, but bottled and dabbed behind the ears. So even when she spoke, her words carried the scent of mortality turned divine. Her nails, polished not with lacquer, but with crushed beetle shells and powdered bone, sparkled in ways that made even light feel inadequate. Her body was no longer her own, but it was still her greatest weapon. She sharpened it daily. Even her silences were scented. Even her pauses had texture. She once entered a negotiation, draped not in silk, but in linen soaked in donkey milk, left to sour in the sun for 3 days. The stench was unbearable. One advisor vomited before she even spoke, but she said nothing. Just sat. Let the scent crawl into every crevice of the chamber. Let it coat the throats of her enemies. Let it distract, disarm, and disturb. And only when they were too dizzy to speak, too disoriented to calculate, only then did she whisper her terms. They agreed. Of course they did. Because who argues with a storm? Who debates with a rot so confident it wears a crown? Cleopatra didn't win because she was clever, though she was. She didn't win because she was beautiful, though that was weaponized too. She won because she understood what no man, no empire, no scholar would admit, that filth is unforgettable. And if you wrap it in enough divinity, they will call it perfume. And they did. And they still do. And maybe, just maybe, tonight, you will too. There's a moment, subtle, irreversible, when a person realizes their body has become a message. Not a vessel, not a temple, not even a weapon anymore, but a letter, written in texture and temperature and scent, folded daily into robes and rituals, and released into the world as a declaration. Cleopatra passed that moment long before anyone noticed. Long before Rome whispered about her incense-soaked thighs. Long before Alexandria's poets started mistaking her filth for metaphor. She knew her body was no longer private. It was policy. And policy, in her kingdom, was never clean. It was oiled. It was fermented. It was blistered and perfumed and salted and sealed beneath tapestries of linen and myth. Every pore spoke. Every secretion was scripted. And every meeting, especially the ones with men who claimed to rule the world, began not with words, but with scent. Because by now, Cleopatra had refined it. The science of stench. The rhythm of rot. The exact ratio of decay to seduction. It made knees tremble and diplomats forget their names. She had chambers dedicated to testing it. Not perfumeries, but cathedrals of corruption, where animal glands hung from copper hooks, and slaves in silence stirred pots of liquefied history. No one spoke in these rooms. No one dared. The air was too thick. One inhale too deep, and you remembered your own death. That was the point. Cleopatra didn't just want to be remembered. She wanted to become memory, sticky, permanent, slightly sour. When the envoy from Parthia arrived, they expected gold. Banners, virgins dressed as priestesses. Instead, they found a corridor washed in vinegar, lined with urns of cooling blood, and the queen herself, waiting at the end her arms, painted in a paste of mold and pearl dust, her nails the color of drying scabs, her eyes rimmed in kohl, so dark it looked bruised. She didn't greet them. She stood, and the scent hit them like a blade. It wasn't violent. It was patient. The kind of scent that waits until you think it has faded, and then crawls into your mouth like regret. They bowed, not from respect, from surrender, and she hadn't said a word, because Cleopatra didn't debate. She infiltrated. She didn't argue her place on the throne. She absorbed it into her skin and let the stench of her certainty do the talking. Her presence wasn't a performance. It was a gas, unseen, untraceable, but always fatal to hesitation. And yet, and here is the cruelty, she was still lonely. Because diplomacy in decay is not the same as intimacy. There were nights when the oils felt heavier than armor, when the dung cracked too deep, and the pearl powder clung to her breath like dust in a mausoleum. Nights when the bed felt like a sarcophagus, and her own scent made her eyes water. Nights when even the priests averted their gaze, not out of reverence, but out of confusion, unsure whether they were still serving a queen or something older, something leaking from the cracks of time. She felt it too, the drift, the slow undoing of her humanness. She could still remember the first time her reflection recoiled. Not the mirror, no, mirrors are loyal in their cruelty, but the water. The bath prepared with blue lotus and melted honey, meant to soothe, to soften, to bring her back to some primal sweetness. She stepped in. The water clouded. The oil separated. The scent, even without dung, still carried a residue, something that made the servants hold their breath. She reached for the edge of the tub, looked down, and saw her reflection ripple, not from movement, but from rejection. The water did not want her. It couldn't absorb her anymore. She had become too dense, too coated, too much. And that was when she knew diplomacy would never again be conducted in wine or words. It would be conducted in flesh, in the scent of dried blood behind her ears, in the warmth of rot between her thighs, in the sheen of her hair that no longer moved in wind but glistened like tar, heavy, hot, holy. Her body had outlived her body, and so she leaned into it harder. She invented a new protocol, one where gifts sent to foreign courts were not embroidered silks or golden beetles, but sealed jars of her bathwater, carefully filtered, sometimes mixed with cinnamon, sometimes with the tears of virgin girls forced to watch her bathe, to witness, to confirm, to carry the scent back in their breath. Emperors received them with confusion. Some smashed them. Others kept them hidden, like contraband. But none forgot, because once you smell the underworld dressed in honey, you never smell anything else the same again. It was her signature, her currency, her revenge, and it worked. Because people don't fear beauty. They devour it, but they fear rot. And Cleopatra? She was rotting on purpose, rotting with precision, rotting as an art form. She could have chosen otherwise. She had access to purity, rose oils pressed in moonlight, linen woven from untouched cotton, slaves bred to sweat sweet. But she didn't want purity. Purity doesn't survive. Purity fades. She wanted permanence. And permanence, she realized, always comes wrapped in disgust. And now you know that too. Because you're still here, reading, breathing it in. Which means you've been touched by it, not literally, but deeply, invisibly. You felt her crawl through your thoughts like a slow scent unraveling in a closed room. That's diplomacy, Cleopatra style. There comes a moment, always, when the rot stops being something you apply and begins to bloom from within. Cleopatra knew the moment had arrived when her own breath began to sour in her mouth, no matter what paste she swallowed. It wasn't the crocodile dung, or the donkey milk, or the powdered coral she dabbed behind her ears to mimic youth. No, this was different. It wasn't scent. It was silence. A stillness that pressed behind her ribs like a fist. A sourness that wasn't physical but spiritual. The scent of something that had once been alive, now beginning to disagree with her. Herself. Because there is only so long one can pretend to be divine before the body begins to rebel. And her body, the same body she had turned into temple and theater and throne, had grown tired. Tired of being lacquered in blood and fat. Tired of being the nation's altar. Tired of being kissed by strangers who bowed not out of love but legend. Tired of being touched only through the veil of awe or disgust. Tired, most of all, of being forgotten by herself. She no longer recognized her own hunger. She hadn't tasted anything unperfumed in years. Even water had to be steeped in flower rot or sacred ash. The palace cooks knew better than to prepare anything that didn't bleed aroma. A piece of bread that didn't reek of anise was discarded. Dates without clove-stuffed pits were deemed offensive. Nothing was neutral. Nothing was plain. Even her sleep was scented, her sheets soaked in boiled mint and piss of castrated bulls, believed to ward off death. But death didn't wait at the door. It slipped in quietly, between the folds of her silks, into her lungs, under her tongue. It waited inside the woman, who forgot what she used to smell like. Because the truth, the brutal, irreversible truth, was that Cleopatra had become allergic to herself. Her skin broke out in sores that even her alchemists couldn't explain. Her breath stank in a way that couldn't be masked. Her thighs bled raw from pastes that used to please the gods. Her fingernails peeled from their beds, as if trying to escape the body they'd been nailed to. She was decomposing alive. And the worst part? She had asked for it. No one forced her into rot. No one pressed the dung to her cheeks. She chose this. Engineered it. Perfected it. Until her own decay outpaced nature's. Until the embalming began decades before actual death. Until she was not merely preparing for the grave. She was the grave. And Alexandria loved her for it. Worshipped her. Wept for her. Not because she was dying, but because she refused to die clean. Because she dragged them with her. Into myth, into memory, into a sense so pungent it became prophecy. But in the final quiet moments, when the incense burners were unlit, and the courtiers dismissed, Cleopatra would press her fingers to her lips and inhale, not to savor, but to ask, "Who am I under all this?" And she didn't know, because the rot had replaced the answer. She remembered once, a memory so old it tasted like someone else's. She was young, not queen, not even royal, just a girl. Her skin untouched, her hair unperfumed, her feet calloused from walking the Nile's edge. She had touched a flower, just one, blue lotus, still fresh, still wet. It had no scent, only dew. She sniffed it, and for a moment, she felt everything the priests said she would never need. Freedom, forgetting, flesh. That was the last time she remembered not smelling like something dead. And she wept. Not then, not in the memory. But now, decades later, slumped in a bath of vinegar and almond rot, weeping without sound, because sound betrayed weakness, and even her tears smelled of fermented salt. Her servants noticed, though none said it. They moved more slowly now, not out of reverence, but out of confusion. The queen they had perfumed into a goddess was beginning to unravel. Her oils clung longer. Her robes stained faster. Her breath warmed the air like rot before rain. Her eyes no longer gleamed with myth. They flickered like a flame realizing it's run out of oil. And still, she endured. Because to die now would be to admit that the filth was borrowed, that it never belonged to her, that it was costume, not character. So she doubled down. She ordered more dung, older dung. Dung taken from crocodiles who died of disease, believed to carry the stink of prophecy. She mixed it with honey aged beyond use, applied it directly to her face, let it burn until blisters formed, let the pain remind her she was still real, still queen, still rotting for a reason. Even as her blood thickened, even as her stomach rejected food, even as the mirror finally cracked, not from impact, but from refusal. She had become more scent than self, a walking reliquary of rituals too sacred to question, a monument to the power of never washing off. But at night, when her lungs wheezed and her bowels bled, and even the gold on her fingers felt heavy with regret, she would whisper to herself, a prayer, maybe, or maybe just a confession. Let the world remember the smell, even if it forgets the woman. Because by then she knew there would be poems, and lies, and plays, and coins, and tombs. But there would be no resurrection, only rot, and rot remembers, always. They kept watching her, even when her voice grew raspier, even when her steps left trails of oil, instead of footprints, even when her eyes blurred from unspoken fevers and the skin behind her ears peeled from many years of rubbing myrrh into bone. They kept watching. Advisors, priests, lovers, enemies, even the walls. And Cleopatra began to understand the worst part of divinity, that once you become a god, you are no longer allowed to change. Not visibly, not painfully, not honestly. You must perform your power, even while dying. You must smile through the stench of your own unraveling. And she did, because by this point, she no longer knew how not to. The rituals had calcified into reflex. She no longer needed instruction. The dung mixed itself in her mind. 2 parts crocodile waste, 1 part fermented goat milk, crushed with salt from the edge of the Red Sea, the salty kind, the kind scraped with bone. Her hands knew the rhythm, even when shaking, even when numb. The paste smeared onto her belly before sunrise, just as always, just as if she were still 20, still dazzling, still dangerous. But now it was armor for a war long over, and no one told her. That's what they don't tell you about power. That it doesn't leave all at once. It lingers. It echoes. It lets you keep performing in the spotlight, even after the stage has collapsed and the audience is ghosts. Cleopatra stood in ruins and imagined ovations. She inhaled silence and heard gasps. She dabbed perfume onto dying skin and believed it would still seduce Rome. But Rome had moved on. Rome was sharpening its knives while she reapplied her past. She smelled stronger now. Not because she was more alive, but because she was less. The rot no longer waited at the surface. It rose through her, like mist through cracked marble. Even her urine reeked of history. Her breath was vinegar and memory. And still, she painted her lips with beetle. Still, she soaked her ankles in vinegar and dried rose. Still, she greeted visitors with the same tilt of chin and that scent, that heavy, thick, damp scent that once made emperors weep and poets hallucinate. But there were no more poets, only record keepers, and they didn't write odes. They wrote inventories of how much oil she consumed, of how many slaves fainted from the scent, of how long it took for her to speak, now that her lungs filled slower, her throat closed faster, her body labored to keep pace with her legend. Even her spit had turned dark, touched with blood, but she smiled, because it matched her robes, because it tasted like prophecy. She had stopped eating altogether, not out of discipline, but because nothing tasted clean enough anymore. The palace had been so saturated in rot for so long that even fruit arrived perfumed. Even water smelled of memory. She tried once to eat a fig, plain, fresh, unadorned, the kind a child might steal from a tree. She bit it and gagged, not from taste, from confusion. The sweetness was too honest. It didn't match the rest of her. It made her remember something she'd buried beneath layers of ceremonial bile. She threw it across the room. It splattered against the stone like an accusation, and the silence that followed was the loudest thing she'd ever heard. The walls held their breath. The slaves trembled. The guards outside the door clenched their jaws, because they all knew what it meant when the queen rejected fruit. It meant she had chosen the tomb, not a carved one, not marble or gold, but the living tomb, the performance, the act, the ritual that never ends. Because once you rot for power, you cannot stop rotting, not until the applause dies. And they were still clapping, with their eyes, with their silence, with their loyalty that stank of fear. No one dared ask her to stop. No one dared bring her something clean. Even the children born in the palace were taught not to cry too loud near her, not because she was cruel, but because her scent lingered in their lungs, and they coughed for days. Midwives whispered of babies born with the smell of her oils in their mouths. Nurses burned their linens, but Cleopatra smiled. That means they'll remember me. And isn't that what all of this was? Every bath of fermented blood, every scrub of donkey bile, every bite of salt-cured honey mixed with decayed lotus. All of it, memory insurance. History embalming. The only problem? She forgot who was underneath. Because now, when she stripped bare, not for lovers, but for mirrors, there was no skin, only residue, no scent, only warning. No woman, only monument. And monuments, you see, don't get to leave the stage. They crumble, publicly, and they smell like gods who stayed too long. There are queens who die quietly, draped in linen, lips washed, cheeks powdered, surrounded by sycophants pretending to mourn. And then there was Cleopatra, a queen whose death began long before the body followed, who did not wait for silence to be swallowed, who chose her decomposition like a crown, wore it louder than gold, louder than Rome, louder than the gods who forgot her name, and dared to remember only her perfume. But hers was not a death. It was a persistence, a refusal to exit, a performance so complete that even dying had to become ritual. Even the decay had to be curated. The final days were the loudest, not in voice, but in presence. Her scent had thickened to the point where it no longer clung to the air. It was the air. Every room she entered became a womb, hot, breathless, sealed. Servants fainted. Walls wept. The palace began to flake, not from disrepair, but from mimicry, as if even the stones were beginning to rot with her, as if the bricks had decided that if the queen would not be clean, then neither would they. And still she rose, each morning, sat naked on the edge of her vinegar bath, let the attendants smear her down with the thickest paste yet, this time a blend of rotting olive pulp, bat guano, expired rose tar, and the burnt bones of her favorite cat. She did not flinch, not even when it burned, not even when it opened sores that hadn't closed in weeks. She simply breathed through her mouth and whispered instructions, not prayers, directives. Even at the edge of death, she was planning her sense inheritance. Seal the oils in lead, she said, and bury them near the tomb, but not inside. Let them leak into the ground. Take the cloth from my final bath and shred it into paper. Let the scribes write prophecy on rot. Let no one say I smelled like jasmine. And she meant it, because jasmine was for brides, for clean women. For girls untouched by empire, Cleopatra had outlived that scent, replaced it with something that could not be bottled, only remembered. Something so potent it could stain time itself. She didn't want statues. She wanted air. She wanted the world to inhale 2,000 years from now and flinch, just a little, without knowing why. That was her immortality. She wasn't embalmed. She was distilled. Even as her liver failed, she demanded the bathwater be stirred with sacred bronze, the same blade used in her coronation, the same one used to cut the tongues out of those who doubted her rituals. She bathed in memory, bathed in warning. Her final scrubbing was done by a blind slave girl, one who could not describe what she saw, only what she felt. And what she felt, she said, was heat that didn't belong to the body. And isn't that what Cleopatra had become? Not a body, not a woman, but a temperature, a pressure in the air. The kind you feel before thunder. The kind that makes dogs whimper and old men weep without cause. She had turned her decay into climate, her rot into atmosphere. You didn't need to see her to know she was near. You needed only to stop breathing for a second and realize the air had changed. Even the gods kept their distance in the end. The priests stopped their chants, not out of disrespect, but because they no longer knew which god they were speaking to. Isis? Sekhmet? Something older? Something born not of stars or salt or sun, but of sweat, of bile, of the long, slow art of staying visible while the body crumbled. No one kissed her goodbye. No one touched her feet. She wouldn't have allowed it. The scent was too strong now. It blistered the lips of those who got too close. It burned memories into the noses of children. It warped metal. It stained scrolls. And still, it was not enough. Not for her. Not for what she'd built. Not for what she'd become. She ordered her final mixture the night before she chose to die. Not poison. No, poison is crude, sudden, uncontrollable. Cleopatra had never allowed anything into her body without understanding it first, so she made her own end, drop by drop. Dung from the last sacred crocodile. Milk from a donkey that hadn't eaten in days. A single scale from a serpent that had never been seen in daylight. All reduced, all simmered, all stirred into a paste the color of bruises, a texture of regret. She anointed herself from toe to crown, slowly, with hands that shook but never paused. And as she lay back, skin steaming, breath shallow, robes soaked in what smelled like everything and nothing, she whispered not to the gods, but to the air, "Let me outlive the skin. Let me be the stink they cannot name. Let my breath be prophecy." And then nothing. But even that nothing smelled of her. Even that silence reeked. Even death bowed before her scent. And that was how she won. Not through war, not through men, but through rot. A rot that refused to die. So now you know, not the crown, not the legend, not the coiled serpent draped in gold, but the thing beneath it, the rot beneath it. The heat that burned between her thighs not from lust, but from layers of ritualized infection. The scent that wasn't aroma, but architecture. And maybe, just maybe, you've begun to understand what it means to be remembered not for what you said, not for who you loved, not even for the empire you once ruled, but for the stench that refused to leave a room. What a legacy. What a curse. What a choice. Because it was a choice. Don't let history lie to you. Don't let the marble busts, the Hollywood faces, the whispered poems convince you that Cleopatra was some tragic beauty undone by love. She was a machine of memory. She was war-painted in oil and milk and bile. She was the only woman in the ancient world who understood that to live forever, you don't need armies or heirs. You need something that lingers, something that seeps, something that sticks. And scent sticks. It's the last sense to leave us before death. and the first to return when we wake. It bypasses thought, cuts straight to bone. You can forget a face, but a scent? Never. Cleopatra didn't need statues. She didn't need epics. She needed your nose. She needed you to smell her before you saw her. Smell her long after you left. Smell her in other people and feel ashamed that they weren't her. She turned her body into a ghost, her bathwater into scripture, her rot into gospel. And we still inhale her. Maybe you don't think you do. But the jasmine in your shampoo? The almond oil in your lotion? The way you wrinkle your nose at anything natural, but secretly chase perfumes labeled Egyptian musk. That's her. That's her reaching through time. Not with armies, not with scrolls, but with breath. She is in your breath now, and you let her in. And what about you? Would you smear yourself with crocodile dung if it meant your name would outlive marble? Would you coat your skin in fermented pain if it meant your story couldn't be erased? Would you drink bile and sleep beside jars of piss if it meant men would whisper about you long after their own bodies were dust? Don't answer too quickly. You're not as clean as you think. Look at your rituals. Look at the things you apply in the morning, the layers you add before you walk into the world, the sprays, the creams, the powders, the lies. You call it hygiene. You call it self-care. You call it branding. Cleopatra called it the same. She just didn't hide it in flowery words. She didn't soften it. She didn't dilute it. She named it what it was: sacrifice. A daily death. A slow offering of self to the gods of memory. And what gods you have now. The algorithm. The feed. The gaze of strangers through glass screens. Would you not rot for them too? You already are. So maybe Cleopatra wasn't ancient. Maybe she was just early. Maybe she was the first woman who understood the price of eternal relevance. And maybe this is the part you want to admit. Maybe that is why you stayed. Not because you love her. Not because you pity her. But because something in you recognizes her. Something in you knows what it means to perform rot. To paint over exhaustion. To smile through sickness. To perfume decay. To be watched, always watched, and to choose to stink anyway. That is power. That is madness. That is survival. And Cleopatra did not survive. She outlasted. She refused to be rinsed. Refused to be rinsed from history. Refused to be wiped clean. Even in death, she chose to die in layers. Not with grace, but with intention. Not to please, but to pierce. And that's why you know her. That's why we all do. She was the queen who bathed in crocodile dung. And dared you to look away. Dared you to forget. Dared you to smell her. Even now, even here, even centuries later, while lying in bed in a world that believes it has risen above such filth. But has it? Tell me, when was the last time you washed and felt truly clean? When was the last time your scent was yours, and not something bought? When was the last time you bled and let yourself stink? When was the last time you stood naked and thought, this is enough? Cleopatra never did. And maybe she was wrong. Or maybe she was just too honest. And maybe the real reason she frightens us, still. I send thee because she seduced Caesar, or bled Rome dry, or killed herself with a snake. Maybe it's because she reminds us that deep down, we're all rotting for attention. That we all want to leave something behind that smells like us. Not because we're proud, but because we're terrified of being forgotten. And rot refuses to be forgotten. So sleep now, if you can. But know this, she's still here. In your breath. In your sheets. In your hunger to be seen. In the part of you that doesn't want to be clean, only remembered. The queen is dead. Long live the stench.